with a congenital lens coloboma, and as you know, they're also often missing zonules. He also had quite a lot of astigmatism, and his calculation for a toric lens would have been a T5, so you can see we marked here. I'm approaching the eye from the superior aspect because of the working across from the coloboma. The capsule was a little rubbery, and of course, since there's not as much counter traction on it from the zonules, it was a little bit harder than usual starting the capsulotomy, and the capsule felt a little more rubbery. He is a 48, 49-year-old gentleman, so I suppose he's relatively younger, had a younger consistency capsule. But once we got started and going along, fortunately he had enough zonular sufficiency in the rest of the lens that things proceeded fairly well. He did start coughing about 3/4 of the way around, and I cut that earthquake out, but right in just another few seconds here, he starts violently coughing, and so there we go. So then I came back in and finished up the continuous capsulotomy. One thing about a capsular tension segment is that you don't have to have a completely continuous capsulorhexis to use it, but it sure feels a lot safer that way. I then proceeded to do hydrodissection, and I actually kind of planned that if it would hydrodissect out of the bag, being a 48, 49-year-old, that it would make things actually easier. And looking back on it, I think the only thing I might have done is tried to more fully hydrodissect all of the cortex, because there was one little area that was a little more difficult to remove, and I think if I could have had maybe a 90% to 100% cortical cleaving hydrodissection, then this would have been even easier. Well, it wasn't easy, but well, I'm not using any phaco power here. Again, a 49-year-old, so it's a relatively soft cataract, and even though I am not phacoing, but I'm using the phaco tip to INA in the mid-anterior chamber, I think there's fairly low trauma to the endothelium, given that I'm not using any phaco power, and this is a soft lens. Fortunately, the zonules were holding, and the whole rest of the bag was not collapsing. And also, fortunately, he probably still had an intact vitreous face behind there, so we did not get any vitreous prolapse through the area of poor zonules. I did reinforce that area with viscoat every now and then, but I was just able to kind of, on low flow, pretty low bottle, just go slow and aspirate this cataract. Now, had the bag started collapsing, I think I would have put the capsular tension segment in earlier. So here I've got most of the lens out, and I've got some cortex. You saw one little piece of cortex that probably went back into the back of the eye through the poor zonules, so hopefully that will resorb nicely on its own. I wish I had caught that before it slid back, but so what I'm trying to do here is try to test the waters and see if I can remove as much cortex as possible before placing a capsular tension device. So I'm able to actually remove a lot of what is subincisionally, but I'm afraid to do any pulling that's anything away from the area of zonular deficiency. So I'm just doing anything that I can where I can pull across. Here it's sort of starting to get iffy, so I am going to abandon this pretty soon for fear of unzipping further zonules. So I just let that go and come out of the eye. So at this point I felt that I would put the capsular tension segment in. Now, I think you could make an argument for putting in a capsular tension ring, maybe a Sione, just in case you need to sew it in. The advantage of the capsular tension segment here is that it's easier to get the cortex out, and only one edge of it would be holding down the cortex. And this device is suturable, and so feeling that this would add additional stability beyond a regular capsular tension ring. Again, the Sione ring would have also been an option with an eyelet, and then there would have been the option to sew that as well. Being that this man's lens capsule might also be hypoplastic inferiorly, that there's also kind of a question as to how a ring or segment would centrate in there. So that was kind of an unknown to me. What I'm doing next here is making a conjunctival peritomy to access the bare sclera and to tie my sutures and sew the capsular tension segment. I think a very slick way of doing this would have been to do a Hoffman pocket, but I thought that it might be better to have direct visualization the first time that I used this device. So I made a little stab incision, and I had previously made this little stab incision, and I'm inserting the iris hook here to secure the segment before I finish the IA. So this will keep the capsular bag from collapsing. And I think another idea would have been to use the McCool capsular support system. And I have not used that before, and I'm curious how well that works. But I can tell you this worked nicely. What you'll see happened is at the very end of where the cortex was trapped a little bit under the segment, it did pull that part of the segment out of the fornix a little bit, of the capsular fornix. But that's no big deal. You can just reposition it, and for the most part, it really held everything in place very nicely. And I think if there were a capsular ring in there, we would have been struggling a little more to get this cortex out. So pros and cons. The segment, the manipulation inside the eye, was, a little awkward, not too bad, but it's kind of this free-floating little piece of PMMA. So here you see kind of I'm trying to pull it out from under, so stripping it out tangentially from underneath that segment. So we're done here, and my intention here was to use this groove to hide the proline suture in the proline suture knot in case I wasn't able to rotate the knot into the sclera. Now, things in life don't always go how you envision them. You'll see later that my suture didn't end up in that groove, but what I'm doing here is taking the capsular tension segment out so I can pass the 9.0 proline on a long curved needle through the eyelet. And I've seen people actually pass it in the eye, but I think with my skills I felt more comfortable bringing it out, passing the suture, and then replacing it back in the eye. So there's a lot of futzing there to get it in the in and out, but it's doable. I think Alan and Crandall and Ike Ahmed, people like that, make this look so easy. They have amazing surgical skills. But so here's the pass of the first needle, double-armed 9.0 proline, had already been fed through the eyelet in the capsular tension segment, and I had. There is a technique where you use a 27 gauge needle to dock the needles, so for more precise placement. And I was struggling with the angle of that a little bit because he had a pretty prominent nose and a malar area. So I just ended up passing in ab interno. Now, there was a small knot on the sclera, and for fear of, I tried to bury it, but it wasn't burying easily, so there is a small knot that's kind of in a little bit of a suture hole, and that is something that I hope won't erode. If it erodes, I may have to go back in later and cover that up. But so here you see me cinching it down a little bit. There's a few little stria in the posterior capsule because, again, I think this capsular bag was a little hypoplastic. So, but you can see it cinches up and disappears out of view, that capsular tension segment eyelet. So I feel confident that I can put a toric lens in the bag now, and making sure that it does get in the bag. And everything's a little tighter because of, again, I think this hypoplastic bag, making sure the haptics get under the capsular rim so we don't end up with a lens accidentally in the sulcus. So here it is, cleaning out the viscoelastic, and I got pretty lucky that the lens didn't have to be rotated much, and you can see my ink markings in the toric lined up very nicely. And finally, here is securing the conjunctiva together, and he had some nice 49-year-old conjunctiva. It wasn't a real elderly, thin conjunctiva. Everything sealed up nicely, the one superior incision and two